B Ford. I want to touch on a few other things, like a pre-ship history, just kind of set the stage, if you will. I want to talk about the Wydante Native Americans, Edwin F. Holmes, Captain J.B. Ford, the Civil War, and Suzanne Bransford. We have a Suzanne in the back. Okay, next. The Native Americans were in the Great Lakes region, Huron. They were basically a Huron tribe of the Iroquois. And after the War of 1812, there was a veteran that he came to southern Michigan and he bought land. He bought a sizable amount of land to homestead, and he named it after the Native Americans that were to the south of him, the Wydante. Later on, his farm became a town and a city. It's still a city today. They produced ships. They still have a chemical plant there. In the 1890s, Captain J.B. Ford, which Steamship J.B. Ford, there's a tie-in. He came to that area looking for soda ash for the plate glass industry to help with production. He had a plant down in Ford City, Pennsylvania, and down there that plant closed in 1991, but they had a statue erected by the employees, about 3,000 employees, that were very thankful for him bringing jobs to the U.S. And he went overseas, learned about the glass trade, and then he came back, incorporated everything, and he started using natural resources within the country to develop the industry. So next, this is a letter opener, and if you see here, we have one of the Native Americans that was the trademark logo for the J.B. Ford Company in Wydante, Michigan. I believe it's named after the town, but they included the Native American, and one of their ships was named Wydante as well, one of the self-hook loaders, one of the first self-hook loaders. Next, that's a picture of it. You can see the boom. When you go downtown Buffalo and you see the ships that come in, they have the self-unloading boom. This is one of the ships that would move cargo from Wydante up to Alpena and around Lake Huron. Next. Edwin F. Holmes. I'm trying to bring ties to the state of New York and ties to this greater area, because the title of my book is Chicago Maritime Museum, the Steamship J.B. Ford Tour. And if you look at a lot of the Great Lakes ships, they move. They're not just in Buffalo. They're not just in Lackawanna. They're all over the Great Lakes. And that was the primary, since the Native American days, the French fur trappers, and then moving on to the cargoes. In general, the cargoes would be iron ore from the northern Iron Ranges in upper Michigan and Minnesota. They would come down to the steel plants, like in this area, because it was closer to the railroads. And they would bring coal from the south, the southern quarries up north, to provide heating and produce steam, produce energy, power for the plants up north. And in the Great Plains states, all the grain, the barley, the wheat, the corn, all those would be moved east to the major cities and beyond. So those were the general cargoes. J.B. Ford, when it was first made, it was made for the coal industry. But going back to the slide here, Edwin F. Holmes, he was born on August 8th, 1843 in Orleans County. That's up north of Medina, Albion, for those who are familiar with the area. When the Civil War broke out, he joined the Union Army as a private and moved up in rank to a corporal. He participated in many battles and was in the 10th Infantry for Michigan, so state of Michigan. So soldier, one of his letters, he talked about body aches, and whenever he got his next paycheck, he would get a back brace, because they did a lot of walking. They had the railroad system back then for the Civil War, but they did a lot of walking too. After the Civil War, he went to the lumber and mining business and became quite successful. Later on, he moved out west to Utah, and he married the Silver Queen. He brought her from Utah to Astoria, New York, and that's where they married in 1899. They spent 2 years in traveling Europe, collecting art and being popular. And some of the ships that they sailed on, the liners back then, because they didn't have the planes, the liners back then were Cunard, the Yatura, and the Umbria. Next. This is a picture of Mr. Edwin F. Holmes, the namesake of the J.B. Ford when it was first launched. It was called Edwin F. Holmes. And that's one of the letters. This is available online from the University of Michigan. Union Forever, that's his letterhead. And an interesting note, it's good to talk about this now because it's the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army, for anyone who didn't know that. Next. Suzanne Emery Bransford Holmes. So she was Suzanne, then Bransford, then she married Emery, and eventually she married Holmes. That's the order there. She was born in Missouri, had a 70-acre farm, general store. They were not with the Union, they were on the other side. When the Civil War broke out, her father joined the Confederate Army. He was captured prisoner of war until the end. After the Civil War, like many people, they headed west because that's where the opportunity was, looking for gold, trying to make it rich. They made it to Utah. Suzanne became a seamstress. She married Emery, and he was a postmaster, and they borrowed $8,000 so they can buy some shares on a silver mine, and the silver mine paid out, so they were able to be wealthy. After Emery passed away, she fought her business partners and won. Later on, she met Colonel Edwin Francis Holmes. Then I'm going to bring into Captain John B. Ford. Captain John B. Ford was born in Kentucky. He was his father went to the Battle of War of 1812, and he never returned. His mom sent him to learn a trade, saddlebag making, leather, learning how to do leather works. At 14, he left for Indiana because he wasn't habitant. He didn't like that. At age 20, he married his teacher, age 25. He had a foundry and made railroad parts and metal boxes. Looking at running the numbers, he decided he couldn't compete with the people in Pittsburgh, so he decided to build ships. He built packet steamers on the river in Indiana. They launched at New Albany, Indiana, and they would be used for the Union side to help fight the Confederacy on the river system. I talked about the plate glass industry, the town. He's not related to Henry Ford. So J.B. Ford and Henry Ford, same last name, but different families. They're not related. And over here, we have this is Captain John B. Ford, the father of the plate glass industry. Captain because he made ships. These are some of the ships that he made, packet steamers that ran on the wet river. This is his son, Edward. Edward had J.B. Ford Sr. J.B. Ford Sr. had J.B. Ford Jr. J.B. Ford Jr., not pictured, had J.B. Ford III. So there were a number of J.B. Fords. J.B. Ford Sr., he was the president of Huron Cement Company. That'll be important later in the story. His son, J.B. Ford Jr., was director for the Huron Cement Company. And he was remembered, none of these people are alive, but he was remembered for crowdfunding for the Detroit Orchestra and helping get that on his feet. Next. Joseph Block. Joseph Block is not only the name of a ship, but it was a person. And in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1863, the bottom of Ohio along the river system, he had an idea to buy and sell railroad surplus. During the Civil War, his business grew. At the end of the Civil War, he partnered with Emil Polak, and his business grew because during the war there was a lot of bridges that were blowing up, because if you could disrupt the railroad system, you could stop troop movement. Later on, he moved the business to Chicago because that was the crossroads for all the rail line systems, and it pretty much still is today. His employees, Joseph Hyman and Joseph Michaels, two lifelong employees, they took over the company, renamed it after themselves, and later on Joseph Block moved on to form Inland Steel. They were pretty big in Indiana. His scrap railroad company, through a changing of hands, eventually became Ascon Metals. Ascon Metals is the scrapyard that turned the J.B. Ford into razor blades. So all these families were around during the Civil War, and they all converged through history, through time, via that ship. Next. I'm going to talk about the Hawgood fleet a little bit. Some of the fleet make vessels. The near sister, the J.B. Ford was hull number 329. She was launched she was launched December 12th, 1903, just 5 days before the Wright brothers first brought man into flight. So it's a pretty old boat. In 1903, there's a lot of other major players, capitalist industries that were formed. Harley Davidson, Cadillac Motors, Ford Motor Company. So 1903 is the same year that hull 329, which was Edwin F. Holmes, the start of the J.B. Ford. There was heavy flooding that was dug out. Hull 330 was called the Yellow Kit. The hull was painted yellow, and it was revolutionized. Instead of having like a framing inside where the cargo will be dumped, the iron ore will be dumped into the hold, it had a hopper type, almost like a bridge, so that it would have more space and less chance for the iron ore to be caught up in pockets. It was easier to transport. So the Hawgood family, they were based in Cleveland, Ohio, and they had many modern ships. It's the month of November. I'm so thrilled to be talking here for the month of November, even when we have rain outside, because there's a lot of storms over the years in November that wrecked a lot of ships, and unfortunately a lot of sailors lost their lives during this month. So November gales of 1905, the J.B. Ford was part of that. 1913 was also a survivor of that. American Shipbuilding Company was a major player in building ships. Eventually they became a conglomerate and they bought out other yards, and well, eventually they're gone. But in 1916, the Hawgood family got caught up in a scandal where there were secret commissions. The numbers didn't quite add up. So the court got involved and they made them sell the boats to pay off the shipyard. Eventually the Hawgoods moved to California, but they did enter real estate. Greenwood is a book that I have here. One of the books. He mentions the Arthur interviewing Miss Hawgood, one of the descendants of the Hawgood family. That building, I saw it maybe about 15 years ago. It was a brick building. It had like four floors, maybe 8 apartments. Cleveland Clinic bought it and they leveled it, so it's no more. But it was worth mentioning, I felt. Next. The way that I approach the Steamship J.B. Ford, I talk about the J.B. Ford, but I also talk about a lot of ties to other ships or shipwrecks, that some are below the water and some are still above, or most are scrapped. But I want to mention the Utura. The Utura is sunk on Lake Huron in 1905. It collided with the Amana Stone, and the ship pulled out. It was in heavy fog. They didn't have the benefit of radar at that time, and there was no AIS and a satellite to track these ships. So when it was foggy, the best thing to do was to slow down, and they would listen for the whistle. If they could hear the foghorn, then they knew there was a ship close, and they would try to determine the direction so they wouldn't collide. The Utura was also, if we go back to the Colonel Edwin F. Holmes and his wife Suzanne Bransford, those are the ships that most likely they traveled for their honeymoon to Europe. And they were well known, and they were the last British ships, Cunard liners that had sail and steam. That's what they're noted for. Then later on, larger ships made them non-profitable. The Umbria, the sister ship of the Holmes, was the same length, 440 feet long. It was built in the Cleveland yard, not the Lorain, Ohio yard. That honored the sister ship, RMS Umbria. Branford, I believe, was named for the wife. If you check with Greenwood, he says it's a manor that was a Hawgood family. One of their estates, they named their mansions. But I lean more towards the wife of Mr. Holmes. And the Bransford was 434 feet, so roughly 6 feet shorter than the Edwin F. Holmes or the Umbria. Harold B. Nye was another ship that was a fleet-mate, same company, and it was the last ship to sea near the Apostle Islands at Lake Superior to see the Ira H. Owen before it disappeared in the 1905 storm. Henry B. Smith was a larger vessel, similar to the Tewsbury, which was down in 1959 in the Buffalo River. That's where the first captain of the Edwin F. Holmes, James Jimmy Owens, was lost. All hands were lost on Lake Superior. Witnesses tend to blame the crew, saying they didn't secure the hatches in time and they entered the stormy weather conditions. And the newer ships, the Henry B. Smith and the Abram Stearns and the Lake Salt Lake City ships, they had a telescoping hatch covers, so they were like plates. They were they would telescope together like one plate, another overlap. And how they would, same as the older ships, they would have a tarp and a strong back that would go over them to make them watertight, so they don't leak and fill up the hold and eventually loss of buoyancy. There's a Library of Congress photo of the Bransford. This was the first engineer on the J.B. Ford. This was his first steel boat. So he worked for the company. This was his first steel boat. Then he transferred to Holmes, and he was the first chief engineer on the Edwin F. Holmes. Next. That's a picture of him, and that's his signature. And those are high pressure cylinder, low pressure, intermediate pressure cylinder, low pressure cylinder by stroke. Those were the numbers of the engine. And if you look at it, that would be him there. And they were very patriotic back then. They had some American flags. They had some horseshoes, portraits of women. There's one there, one there. And another interesting thing, I don't know if it was for him or if it was more for Mr. Colonel Edwin F. Holmes. If you look at these two symbols on either side of this light mounted on the engine, that's the Mason symbol, the G and the square. Next. These are images of the ship. The upper one here is the Umbria, and the lower one is the Etura. There's a color painting of the Edwin F. Holmes when it was commissioned. That was a portrait of the ship. These are two images from postcards of the ship. They show the same view, but this one they say it's Duluth, Minnesota, and this one here they say it's Superior, Wisconsin, and the Owlets dock. You can see the details of the Edwin F. Holmes. This would later become the J.B. Ford. Over here you can see they used natural light. They had skylights that would shed a light from the open deck down into the passageways below. They had a capstan, open bridge. This vessel here is the Anna C. Mitch. This was lost in 1940 in the Armistice Day storm in November. It was a Steinbrenner ship, and it was caught in a gale in Lake Michigan, and all hands were lost. Next. That's the image of the Steinbrenner boat, the Anna C. Mitch. That's a Henry B. Smith. That's the one that Captain James Owens was on board. It was a much larger vessel, a 500-footer, and it went out into Lake Superior. The hatches, they say the hatches weren't secured. The wreck was lost for almost 100 years. They just found it in 2015.
Wow.
they discovered the wreck on Lake Superior. That's the Abraham Stearns. This was one of the ships when it was being built, caused a controversy where they started investigating the Hawgoods, an American shipbuilding company. Later on, the ship, after 1916, the court sale, eventually became the Tewsbury, which, as we all know, went down in, or maybe you don't know, in 1959, the sister ship, the Umbria, became the GLSS, which was a Steinbrenner boat, and then it broke from its moorings over at Concrete Central Elevator, navigated at 3 bends in the river, heavy ice flow, and it struck the stern, struck the bow right here, the Tewsbury, and then the two went down. So the GLSS was kind of like the firing pin, and this was the bullet that took out the bridge. So they had, I talked a little bit about the doors because I like to analyze details. And you can go to the next slide. So this is a layout plan. Right here, the Umbria, later the GLSS, they had a centerline dining room, but the JB Ford had a dining room off here and then a private dining room here. And it was also noted that in this corner here for the owner's parlor, they had an ice box. During abatement, I actually got to talk to the abatement crew. They nicknamed that area the beer drinking room. Next. So this is just one of the details. They had 5 vertical panels for the wooden doors. If they were built in Lorain, Ohio. If they were built in Cleveland, Ohio, this almost looks similar to a pattern you might see at Lowe's or Home Depot. And that's an image of the Umbria. That's the stern view of the Umbria. And I talked about that. That's when it was launched. They came via the Nickel Plate Railroad across Turntable Bridge. That's where the center and the bridge would turn. After the flooding in January, that's when that bridge got wiped out by the ice flow. Later on, it's something interesting to mention. The 1901 built Henry Steinbrenner was there in Lorain, Ohio, when the JB Ford Edwin F. Holmes swung across, her mooring line snapped and she swung across the bank. There was a lot of chaos with the ice. The bridge center had to be rescued. They had a number of tugboats. They were all wooden. Some of them were swept out onto the open lake, onto Lake Erie. Some of them were crushed by barges or ships, pinned against docks. They had another one that went up on the bank and they rolled over. And so these were coal-fired or wood-fired ships. So when it rolled over, the fire spilled out onto the wooden part of the structure of the ship and it caught on fire. This is a picture of Hull 330. The JB Ford was Hull 329. So this, you can see, it was a lot larger than the JB Ford. And you can see the different style of hatches. There were a lot of modern changes that were built within the Augusta V. Wolverine. Interesting to note, after the 1905 gale, it did come to Buffalo and moor the winter at the Watson Elevator in Buffalo after the storm. And I thought it was interesting, on February 5th, 1904, they had a gang of men that started digging out the bow because it swung hard. I read 2 accounts, and that's why I showed you that postcard where it shows 2 accounts, the same picture, but 2 different interpretations. One says it's Duluth, one says it's Superior. One article says it was the stern line that snapped. A couple other articles say it was the bow line that snapped. There's no imagery to confirm either way, but I'm going with the bow. So once the ship came across the river, the Black River, the water level rose up. It started flooding out all the shipbuilding buildings. The other one, the Augusta V. Wolverine, was in the ways, still being built, so there was an interruption with that. But eventually they were able to resecure it to the dock. And after that, later in the month of 1904, going back to the Holmes family, they returned from their honeymoon in 1901, and that's when they purchased the Gardo House from the Mormon Church. They decided they had all this art. They were big on collecting art. They had all this art, so they decided to build an addition, a garage, 3-car garage. That's how wealthy they were. 3-car garage, and the second floor they had as an art gallery and a music hall. So they would bring in people to play music. They would open their home or that portion of their home a couple days a week for guests to view their art. And this is a picture of some pictures of it. This is all from University of Utah. This is Mr. Holmes later in life. This is Susanna. This is the Gardo House. This is inside their garage, the upper floor. You can see the stage and all the art, portraits of them. This is the outside of it. According to the papers at the time, it was only $10,000. They got a bargain. This is inside the home, and you can see a lot of them collected portraits of Native Americans as well. And this is the floor plan showing 3-car garage at the bottom. After they didn't like the winters in Salt Lake City, so eventually they moved out to California, and they were looking for a buyer. They didn't find a buyer right away. World War I broke out, and they decided to let the American Red Cross use their house until after the war. So after the war, when the war ended, World War I ended, they sold the house back to the Mormon Church. The Mormon Church sold it to the bank bulldozed it, built a new office building. But there's a historic marker if you decide to go downtown Salt Lake City. So let's see, this is talking about the SS America collision in Duluth Harbor. This November 28th and 29th, later in this month, will be the 120th anniversary of the Great Storm of 1905. They call it the Mataafa Storm. The Holmes left Lorain, Ohio, where she was built on the Black River, loaded with coal to bring her up. Now, that gave her advantage because she was lower in the water, so she had more cargo, lower center of gravity. Following her, they passed Port Huron, Michigan. This one passed, Holmes passed around 1 p.m. 2 p.m. the Charles M. Warner passed, and she was upbound and light. The Umbria, her pilot house was damaged on Lake Superior. She had a long battle with a storm. She came in at night, and her forward pilot house, the binnacle and the helm were damaged by the wind and the waves. So a lot of the Great Lake ships, or at least the classic ones, they would have emergency steering station behind the smokestack. And so the deck crew retreated from the bow to the stern of the ship, and they brought the Umbria into Duluth Superior from that emergency helm. The Harold B. Nye witnessed another ship having trouble, but it was having trouble. The rivets were leaking. She was taking on water. She was a few feet lower in the water when she arrived in Two Harbors, Minnesota. The George Gould was the package freighter that was actually built in Buffalo, New York. They were upbound, and the Mataafa, there was